Наверное, где-то за год до дагестанских событий, когда был создан, если я не ошибаюсь, по инициативе Мавлади Удугова был создан Конгресс народов Чечни и Дагестана, эти люди очень долго и не безрезультатно убеждали Басаева о том, что народ в Дагестане готов сделать то же самое, что произошло в Чечне, и стоит только войти в Дагестан, они все поддерживают.
The nationalist rebels who had taken control in Chechnya were beginning to try to create a stable state. Now, from the Islamist point of view, that's not what they wanted. They were not fighting for a free Chechnya. They were fighting a war in Chechnya simply as the first stage to a much greater war, to drive Russia out of the North Caucasus and to create an Islamic caliphate all across the region.
Возможности всех соединить есть, причем возможность огромная, потому что все народы Кавказа, все народы, без исключения, я это подчеркиваю, хотят свободы, хотят независимости от России. Им всем осточертела эта Россия, потому что Российская империя во все века пила ихнюю кровь, уничтожала ихние семьи, ихних родных, близких, захватывала ихние земли и проводила геноцид над ними. Возьмем дагестанцев, те же дагестанцев почти полностью истребили в 19 веке.
Dagestan is also a Muslim culture, a Muslim country, but most of the population aren't practicing. In 1999, they kicked out all Russian officials. They didn't attack anybody. They didn't take hostages. Obviously, when the Russian government caught wind of what was going on, they cracked down on them. They sent in the military, special forces. From what I understand, the elders of the village sent messengers to Basayev, and out of obligation to his fellow Muslims, Basayev and Khattab came up with some kind of plan to go in and assist. The Russian military used that as a pretext to escalate the war.
Нужно понимать, что в этом контингенте, который вошел туда, где-то свыше 60% были сами дагестанцы, процентов 30 чеченцы во главе с Басаевым и процентов 10 представителей разных и постсоветских республик, в том числе и выходцев из Ближнего Востока во главе с Хаттабом.
The Russians were waiting for an excuse to invade Chechnya again. So they gave them that opportunity. That was a mistake.
The Russians responded in force, and Shamil and Khattab retreated back into Chechnya.
They seem genuinely to have believed that the Russian army and state were so rotten that even if they couldn't actually overthrow the whole republican order in Dagestan, they could give it such a good kick that it would in fact crumble, and that eventually the Russian army would be forced to withdraw. As one must remember, it had withdrawn from Chechnya 3 years earlier. Now this looks like an insane fantasy, but of course the revelation of Russia's weakness in the first Chechen war, when the Russian army was in practice defeated by the Chechens, was so great that it was perhaps not surprising that it went to their heads.
Among the Russian people, there was no stomach for a second war. That all changed when a series of devastating bombs went off throughout Russia. They were immediately blamed on Chechen rebels.
The Chechens always claim what they do. If they didn't claim it, I believe they didn't do it.
I honestly don't know about that. It could obviously have been a Chechen group. It could have been the international Islamists. It could have been one of the Dagestani ethnic groups who had been targeted by the Russian army in response to the incursion. Or, of course, there is the suggestion that it could have been an element of the Russian secret services trying to provide an excuse or justification for a renewed war. And I haven't seen any conclusive evidence to prove any of those false suppositions.
It's hard to believe that the Russian security forces, as some assert, were involved in creating it as a provocation. Shamil Basayev himself at times accepted responsibility and at times said there were nothing to do with him.
Whether or not Chechens planted the bombs, Russian public opinion had turned, and the Russian leadership, now under President Putin, could send Russian troops back into Chechnya on a wave of public support. In the fall of 1999, the Russians initiated a devastating bombing campaign that marked the start of the Second War.
I had made a vow that if there was another battle for Grozny, that I wouldn't miss it this time. Khattab was there, I believe, fighting for the airport at Kankala in 1999. From my position, we could hear his group fighting day and night. It was that much of a battle.
Я, в принципе, вышел из Чечни по приказу Масхадова. Это было к тому моменту, когда русские части северного направления начали подходить к Грозному, по сути дела, делать это кольцо. Было принято решение, что я должен выехать и пытаться восстановить связи с ОБСЕ, с Парламентской ассамблеей Совета Европы, пытаться встречаться с политиками различных уровней, пытаться, в общем-то, привлечь внимание к тому, что там происходит.
Chechen and Mujahideen units held Grozny until mid-January, when the field commanders decided to make a tactical withdrawal. The Chechens planned to use a minefield as a corridor out of the besieged capital. But during their retreat, they triggered the mines and attracted artillery bombardment. The withdrawal was a military disaster. Numerous senior field commanders and as many as 500 fighters died during the retreat. Basayev himself lost a leg.
Они прекрасно знали, что все заминировано, они знали, на что идут. Поэтому впереди шли командиры. Этим и объясняется тем, что много известных командиров, в том числе бывший мэр города Грозного Лечи Дудаев, такие, в общем-то, известные полевые командиры, как Асланбек Исмаилов, который был в то время начальником Грозненского гарнизона, как Хункарпаш Исрабилу, они все погибли во время этого выхода, потому что командиры шли впереди.
Ever since that brutal withdrawal from Grozny, although the Chechen fighters are still maintaining their guerrilla struggle, they no longer have the numbers, they no longer have the unity and the cohesion that they can launch a major military offensive again. They can stop the Russians from winning, but they can't actually beat the Russians.
The Chechens had been dealt a crushing blow, but that didn't mean an end to the fighting. The war basically became a series of cleansing operations and bombing campaigns by the Russians and guerrilla attacks by the Chechens. In spring 2002, Khattab, the Russian tank killer, was killed by a poisoned letter. Russian authorities claimed success and hoped his death would be a significant blow to Islamic radicalism in Chechnya.
A lot of the fighters, myself included, even if I had personal differences with him, we looked up to Khattab as something as a superhero. I think a lot of the Muslim world looked up to Khattab as something as a heroic figure. He was somebody that couldn't be killed, he couldn't be destroyed. But he would constantly remind us that he was just one of many fighters and that if he was killed, somebody would take his place and that the fight wouldn't end with him.
Khattab was just a soldier. Because Khattab is dead, that doesn't stop them. They still continue.
On October 22, 2002, people watching a patriotic musical at a Moscow theater were stunned as more than 40 armed Chechens, under the command of Mosfar Barayev, seized the theater, taking several hundred hostages. They released all Muslims and some children, and Barayev demanded the same concessions as Basayev in Budyonovsk, primarily the complete withdrawal of Russian troops from Chechnya. He threatened to blow up the theater if his demands were not met. The spectacular raid appeared to prove one of Putin's claims, that the Chechens still fighting were terrorists, while drastically undermining another, that the war was over.
The Moscow theatre attack was actually a major escalation. It should be taken really as an attack in its own right. It certainly wasn't a copycat. It certainly wasn't really part of any kind of trend. It marks the beginning of a major escalation, an attempt to genuinely actually force the Russians to be afraid of the Chechens. It didn't really have any expectation that it would force the Russians to pull out of Chechnya. They didn't expect to get out of this raid alive. What they really just wanted to do was just simply to strike back.
I can't say that I agree with the operation. Taking a military base or a police station might be a little different. Taking a theater, it's not my style. But I think the Chechens wanted to make a statement that if you attack our civilians, you kill our women and children, we'll do the same to you.
On the fourth day of the standoff, Russian special forces pumped in a poisonous gas that put everyone in the theater to sleep. They then broke through ceilings and floors and killed all the militants. The gas killed 129 spectators, many of them reportedly dying for lack of treatment, because Russian authorities withheld information about the gas used from doctors on the scene. Among the dead militants were female suicide bombers, known as Black Widows.
The Black Widows are women who lost their husbands, who lost their children during the First and the Second War. They are women who have absolutely nothing to lose. They lost everything, so they are ready to die. They are very vengeful, the Chechen.
Chechen warfare has always been about striking now, getting away so you can strike again tomorrow, rather than going down in glory. And what we've seen is, in recent attacks, the rise of the so-called Black Widows are women suicide bombers. And this is why they had bombs strapped to them, after all. It was essentially to ensure that, firstly, they could not be disarmed, but also that it was a symbol that basically they did not plan or expect to survive. They'd already made the decision that they were going to die.
The presence of the Black Widows gave credence to President Putin's claim that the so-called Chechen independence movement was a front for Islamic terrorists. Russia's critics contended that the Black Widows and militant Islam were the result of a culture created by the ruthless way the Russian military prosecuted both wars. But Moscow denied any responsibility for creating the conditions in which Chechen terrorism had escalated. They pinned responsibility, instead, on Shamil Basayev and Chechnya's exiled president, Aslan Maskhadov.
It's not surprising that the Russian authorities have tried to blame Shamil and Maskhadov together for the theatre attack, essentially because the Russian tactic has always been to try and make all the Chechen rebels seem to be Islamic extremists. They've always tried to downplay the sense that there is actually any distinction between nationalist guerrillas and Islamist terrorists. In fact, though, they're wrong. And they know they're wrong. I think if you look at the internal reports that go into the Kremlin, they actually do have a much more nuanced idea of what's going on in Chechnya. But for public consumption, they basically blame everything on Shamil and Maskhadov equally.
Был бы Басаев, я думаю, что едва ли спецслужбам удалось бы так быстро и без проблем и столь самым, в принципе, нелепым образом все это прекратить. Поэтому я думаю, что Басаев просто всего лишь включился в это уже на пропагандистском уровне, когда он взял на себя эту ответственность за Норд-Ост.
It doesn't seem likely that Shamil actually originated it. Probably it was actually that Barayev and those around him came up with the idea. Shamil blessed the raid. Maskhadov almost certainly had no knowledge of it. Certainly that's what he says. Maskhadov was desperately trying to find ways of avoiding that escalation. Maskhadov would have known that an attack like this in Moscow would have done nothing to actually have allowed any peace talks to take place.
For the next 2 years, Maskhadov and Basayev remained fugitives. Neither man participated in the Moscow-sponsored August 2004 elections in Chechnya, which saw a pro-Russian candidate,